Hey there, Emmanuel here from WebDevFuel and welcome back. In this video we're going to go over how to set up infinite scrolling with Go and HTMX. So by the end of the video we are going to have the ability to visit a particular page, see a number of posts, and then when we click on the load more button, more posts are going to be loaded until there are no more posts left and the load more button is going to be hidden. And also, if you want to follow along, I'm going to leave a link in the description down below to the GitHub repo so you can see each one of the branches for each one of the steps in this video. We have here a Go and HTMX project, and for the templating we are using templ. I went ahead and set up this previously before recording this video, so if you want step-by-step instructions on how to do this setup from scratch, I'm going to also leave a link in the description down below to a previous video where I go a bit more in depth on how to set up all of this completely from scratch. So the first thing that we want to do is we want to start by setting up the templates. So let's open here the template directory and we want to create a new file that we'll call post.templ. Let's open this and let's add the following contents. For now we are going to see here an error, and that's because we haven't yet implemented the logic for the post, but we can ignore that for now. So we first of all want to specify the package name, which is going to be template, and then we have two different templates inside of this file. Now, if you are not aware of exactly how templ works, it allows us to have multiple different templates inside the same templ file, and that's exactly what we are doing here. We first of all have this post template that is going to take a list of posts and it is going to range through each one of them. As you can see, this is the exact same syntax that we would use when using Go directly inside of a Go file. And then for each one of these posts, we are going to use this post template. So we range here through each one of them, and then we call this template that we have down here. Then this post template is going to take one individual post, and it is going to render a div with the ID of post dash and then the ID of the particular post that we are currently looping through. And then we have here some classes to make this post look nice, and inside of the div we have two different p tags, one for the title and then another one for the description. Now we want to set up the templates related to the infinite scroll functionality, so let's create here a new file and we'll call this one infinite scroll.templ, and let's paste here the contents and let's go over each one of the things that we have here. First, we start by defining the infinite scroll template, which takes the post, and then inside of it we want to first of all define here the base layout, and that's because this is going to be the template that we are going to render when we do the initial navigation to our post page. Then inside of this we have this div, which is a grid with two different columns, which we'll be using to display our posts. This has the ID of posts, and inside of this we want to use the post template that we've previously created. Then we have this load more button, which takes the current cursor so that we can render the URL to see more posts correctly. The next templ template that we want to define is posts and button, and this is also going to take a list of posts and then the last cursor, which is an int. And we'll be using this template to do all of the rendering when it comes to HTMX. So we'll have two different kinds of requests occurring, the initial request and then the HTMX request, which we'll be using to load more posts as the user requests them. Next, we define the load more button, which, like I said previously, it takes in as an argument the cursor, which is an integer. And here inside of this template, we want to first of all define this div, which has the ID of load more. Then we want to say here hx swap ob equals true, and we'll get to that in just a second. And then we also want to define here the class, which will help us essentially with having the indicator to the end user that we are currently loading more posts. But again, we'll get to that in just a second. Then inside of the div we have this button which has this hx-get attribute, and to get the correct URL or the correct path we use this function that we went ahead and call this load more path and query. This function takes in as an argument the cursor, and then if the cursor equals 0 then we want to simply return /infinite-scroll, and if not we want to return also infinite-scroll, but in this case we want to pass as a query param the cursor. So we say here cursor equals %d, and then we can pass here this integer, and by using this printf function then Go is going to construct this path for us. Then we want to specify the target, which is going to be the ID of post, and this is the exact same thing that we have up here. So what this essentially means is that the main response that is going to come back from our Go backend is then going to be placed here inside of the DOM based on this ID of posts. And since we don't want to replace this entire thing, but rather append the contents that are going to be coming from the Go backend, so we essentially want to have a list of posts and then more posts being added at the bottom, we also want to specify the swapping strategy, which is going to be before end. And again, what this essentially means is we have this ID of posts, and we want to include all of the results that are going to come from our Go backend here at the bottom, so essentially before the end of this element. Then we have this hx-indicator, which we'll be using to let the end user know when a request is occurring. So we specify here the ID of load more, and by specifying this ID, HTMX is going to add here as an additional class the HTMX-request. And then by combining this with the group feature that Tailwind CSS provides us with, then we can say here group dash and then HTMX request opacity 50, and we can also hide the spinner by default, but if we have also here group HTMX-request, then it is going to be blocked, and the end result will be that when we make a request to the Go backend using HTMX, then we are going to see the button with the opacity of 50% and a loading spinner, again to let the end user know that a request is currently occurring. And finally, the last step to set up our templates is going to be to add a few additional classes here to our body element to ensure that all of this looks nice in the end result. If you want to learn more about how to build web applications with HTMX, Go, and PostgreSQL, then go to webdevfuel.com/hgsb or click the link in the description down below to join the HTMX Go SaaS blueprint. Now we are ready to set up all the logic to be able to fetch our posts. Now, since the goal here is not really to go over how to do this when it comes to the database, but instead to see how we can combine Go and HTMX to do infinite scrolling, we are going to use mock posts and simply fetch them from a JSON file. So back to the code editor, let's create here a new directory that we'll call post, and then let's create a new file that we'll call results.json, and let's paste here our mock post. So as you can see, for each one of the posts we have an ID which is an integer, and then we have a title and a description, both of which are strings. Now let's create a new file here that we'll call post.go, and inside of this file let's paste here all of the logic and let's go over exactly what's happening here. So first we want to start by defining our post structure, which is going to have an ID, the title and the description, and just like I said, we have here the integer, and both of these are strings. And we also want to ensure that we specify here the correct JSON tag, which is going to be lowercase id, lowercase title, and also lowercase description. Then to make all of this easier to type, we want to make here a type alias, so post is going to be an alias to a slice of post. And finally, we get to the functions to get our posts and all the logic related to it. So the first function that we want to take a look at is this one that says get first cursor. And the goal of this function is when we don't specify a cursor on our first load more request, then we want to be able to get the first cursor so that we know exactly the number of posts that we want to fetch on the initial request. This function is going to return an integer and also an error. And inside of the function, we want to start by defining here our post, and then we want to get the results byte. Now, what this essentially means is that we want to encapsulate the logic of reading this file and returning the bytes inside of this function. So this function is going to take no arguments and it is going to return a slice of byte and then an error. Then we want to use the OS package and the read file function to be able to read the results, which we've put inside of this results.json file and inside of the post directory. And then we want to do here some error handling. If the error is different than nil, then we want to return an empty slice of bytes. And if not, we want to return the bytes with the contents of this file that include all of our mock posts. Then up here, after we get the results bytes, we want to do also some error handling, and if we have some kind of error, then we want to return 0 and then the error that we get back from this function. Then we want to unmarshal the bytes, and what this essentially means is we want to grab all of these bytes that we get from this file and we want to try and place them inside of this structure. Then if we get some kind of error and this structure does not match what we are trying to unmarshal here, then we also want to return 0 and the error that we get back from this function. Now at this point we already have our slice of posts, so we want to initialize one single post and then we want to range through each one of them. And if the index equals 0, then we want to say that post equals p, which is this thing that we have here, and then we want to break out of this loop. So what this essentially means is when we find the post with the index of 0, so essentially the first cursor, then we want to stop this loop from going through each one of these iterations. And finally, since we'll be using the ID as the cursor, we want to return exactly that. We want to return post.id and the error as nil. Now keep in mind, if you were to have something like a string ID, so for example a UUID, then in that case you would return here an integer, but instead a string. But in this case, since inside of this file we have all of these IDs as numbers, in that case we want to return here the integer, and again the cursor is going to be post.id. Now we are ready to take a look at the next function, which is getPost by cursor and limit, and the function does exactly what the name says. We want to get a list of posts based on the cursor that we pass in as an argument and also the limit. So we want to pass the cursor, for example ID number 1, and then we want to pass also a limit, so for example 4, and that means that we want to get the first 4 posts from our JSON file. And then this function is going to return a list of posts and then also the next cursor and finally an error. We start this function by doing almost the exact same thing that we did with the previous one. So we want to initialize here the post, we want to read from the file, we want to do here some error handling, and then also here after we unmarshal here the file into the posts. Then we want to also initialize the filter post. So this is going to be the list of posts that we want to return and also the cursor index. Then we want to range through each one of the posts, and keep in mind that we want to range through all of the posts that we have available to us and not only the filter posts, since at this point we don't yet have our filter posts. Then inside of this range, if the post ID equals the cursor, then we want to say that the cursor index equals I. So essentially we find the post by the ID and then we assign the index here to this variable. Then after that we want to ensure that we are filtering only by the post IDs that are equal or bigger than the cursor, And inside of this if statement, we want to have another if statement that says that if the index is bigger or equals to the cursor index, and if the index is smaller than the cursor index plus the limit, then we want to add the post to our filtered posts. So if we take as an example the cursor 1 and the limit 4, in this case we would essentially get back the post with the ID of 1, 2, 3 and 4. And that's because 0, 1, 2 and 3 are all either equal or bigger than the cursor index, and they are also all smaller than the cursor index plus limit, which would be 4. Then we have here an if statement that we'll be using for when we don't have any more posts to show. So we want to say here if the length of the filter post equals 0, then we want to return an empty list of posts, and then we also want to return here the cursor as the length of total posts plus 1, and then the error as nil. And finally, we have the logic to be able to grab the next cursor. So we start by grabbing the last post. So we want to say here filtered post, and then the length of the filter post minus 1. And what this will essentially accomplish is we want to have a slice of posts, and then we want to grab the last one from that slice. So like this says, we have here the last post. Then we want to initialize the next cursor, which is an integer. And then we want to range through each one of the posts again. And if the post ID equals the last post ID, we want to assign here to the next cursor the post ID plus 1. So we are essentially looking for this last post, and then we want to do this plus 1, so we want to essentially shift by 1 to the right. And finally we can return the filter post, the next cursor, and the error as nil. And finally we are ready for step number 3, which is to add our route and the handler that is going to take care of the request and return the post based on if it is an quote-unquote initial request or an HTMX request. So let's first of all add here a couple of new functions that we'll be using to help us with all of the logic. So first we have this function that says get cursor or fallback, and this is going to take the pointer to the request and then the key and the fallback value, and it is going to return an integer and also an error. And the goal of this function is pretty simple. We want to be able to pass a key into it, and then we want to get the value based on this key here from our query params. If the string equals an empty string, then we want to return a fallback and the error as nil. And if not, we want to parse this from a string into an integer, and we want to place that here into this cursor variable. If we have some kind of error, then we want to return 0 and the error, and if not, we want to return the cursor that was parsed again from a string into an integer and the error as nil. Then we have two additional functions, each one for the quote-unquote kind of request that we'll be making to our Go backend. And let's start with this one that says handle HTMX request. This is going to take the pointer to our request, and it is going to return, similar to this one, the templ component and then a possible error. Inside of this function, we start by first of all getting the cursor, so we use the function that we just went over, and then we pass here the key cursor, which is going to be the key that we'll be using to track the current cursor of our infinite scrolling, and we want the fallback value to be 5. And what this means is that on the initial request, we don't have any kind of cursor available to us, and instead we want to start by the cursor 5. So we'll have the 4 first posts automatically loaded into the page when we do the initial request, and then we want to start at the cursor of 5. Then we want to use the post package to get the posts by cursor and limit, and we pass here the current cursor that we have available to us and the limit as 4, so we want to increment the posts 4 by 4. So each time that we click on the load more button, we want 4 new posts to be loaded inside of the page. Then we do some error handling, and then we want to grab our component. So we say here component colon equals, and then template.post and button. Now keep in mind that this is the template that we'll be using when we have an HTMX request, and that is not the case with the other template that we'll take a look at in just a second. That one is for the initial request, and this one is for us to have this essentially be sent back to the browser, and then HTMX is going to take care of replacing everything inside of the page. Finally, we return the component and the error as nil, and now we are ready to take a look at the next function, which says handle initial request. And just like with the other one, this is going to return a templ.component and the error. Here we want to start by getting the first cursor, then we want to do here some error handling, and then we want to get also the post by cursor and limit. We pass here the cursor, and the number of posts is going to be the exact same one, so we want to load 4 new posts each time that we do some kind of request to the backend, and that is also going to be the number of posts that we initially see inside of the page. And finally, we grab our component. In this case, we say template.infiniteScroll. We pass here the posts, and then we return the component and the error as nil. Now we are ready to add a new route to handle this request. So let's paste this here. And each time that we make a request with the get method to /infinite-scroll, then we want to start by first of all seeing if this is an HTMX request, and we do this by looking at the request header. So we say here or.header.get, and then we pass here hx-request, and if this equals true, then we know that this is an HTMX request and not the quote-unquote initial request. Then we want to start by also initializing here a new variable with the templ component and also a new variable for the error. Then we want to do here an if else. So if this is an HTMX request, then we want to grab the component and the error from the handle HTMX request function. And if not, we want to grab the exact same thing from the handle initial request function. Then we want to do also some error handling here, which is going to either be this error or this one. And if it is different than nil, then we simply want to return. And finally, we want to render the component. So we say here component.render, which is either going to be this post and button component or the infinite scroll component. And finally, we also want to do some simple error handling just so that this doesn't blow up the program. So we say here if the error is different than nil, then we want to simply return. And lastly, we are ready to give all of this a try. So let's start the server by using the error command. And let's navigate here to localhost port 3000 and then /infinite-scroll. And if we refresh the page, as you'll be able to see, we get 4 different posts loaded initially, and we also have this load more button. And to ensure that we can see the loading state of the load more button, I also went ahead and enabled regular 2G so that all of the requests are throttled. So now let's give this a try. If we click here on load more, as you can see, we get the opacity changed to 50%, and we also see a loading spinner, and then we see 4 additional posts here. So let's do that again and again and one last time, and now I think we are going to see the last set of posts. So as you can see, the final set of posts doesn't come with 4 different posts, but rather with only 1, and that's because we have 25 different posts. So the last time that we click on the load more button, then we are going to only get back 1 post. So if we see here the response, so let's take a look here at the response and see the raw div. So we only have here 1 div, and then also the load more button, which is going to be replaced by using the swap OOB. And in the previous case, we had a lot more posts. So in this case, we had 4 different posts being loaded here into the DOM by using HTMX. If you want to learn more about how to build web applications with HTMX, Go, and PostgreSQL, then go to webdevfuel.com/HGSB or click the link in the description down below to join the HTMX Go SaaS Blueprint. Now, one thing that you might have noticed is that when we don't have any kind of posts left to load, the button is still there, and that's not really the ideal user experience. So if you click here, no more posts are going to be loaded, but we still see this button, and we also still see the loading spinner, which we don't want to happen. We want to essentially, when we don't have any kind of additional post left to see, we want this button to automatically disappear. So let's take care of that as the final step of this video. Inside the infinite scroll.templ file, let's pass a new argument here that we'll call show load more, and this is going to be a boolean argument. And then here, instead of simply having this swap OB, we want to do the following. We want to say if show load more, then we want to pass this attribute, and if not, we want to pass the exact same thing, but instead of having this value be true, we want this to be delete. And this way, if we get this argument as false, instead of HTMX looking within the DOM and then replacing this, it is instead going to look for this ID, and it is going to remove this from the DOM, with the end result being, if we don't have any posts left, then the button is going to be hidden. Now let's fix both of these errors. So we also want to pass the exact same argument here. So let's say here show load more, and this is also boolean, and we want to pass down this argument. And let's also ensure that we pass here the correct value, which by default is going to be true. So when we initially navigate to the page, we want to see the load more button so that we can load additional posts, and we want the correct attribute to be there, which is going to be hx-swap-ob equals true. And finally, let's make a couple of adjustments to the handle HTMX request function. So let's first of all rename this from cursor to previous cursor, so that this is a bit easier to understand. Then we want to also change this here. And then we need to pass an additional argument into this template. So we want to essentially say here, previous cursor is different than next cursor. And now we are going to see here an error, and that's because we need to regenerate our template. So let's run here the error command. And now all of this is working. And what all of this means is if the previous cursor is different than the next cursor, then we want to show the load more button. But if they are the same, then we want to hide the load more button. So now let's give all of this again a try inside of the browser. So let's click here a few more times until we don't have any posts left. And as you can see, if we click here one last time, we don't have any posts left to show, so the button is going to be removed from the DOM. So this is it. This is how you can implement infinite scrolling by using Go, templ, and HTMX. I hope this video was helpful to you, and I'll see you on the next one.